Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to Nature and the Nation. For today's episode, I will be looking at Essays in Experimental Logic by John Dewey. And this was published in 1916 by the University of Chicago. And it's a compilation of essays, and a good portion of them, I believe four of them, were from another book that he had published, Studies in Logical Theory, from 1903. And apparently they, produced a bunch of these books, and then when they ran out of the supply, they wanted to do a reprint, but they wanted to switch it up a little bit. So Studies in Logical Theory had included a bunch of additional essays in it from John Dewey's students. And for the reprint, they cut those essays out, and they just added more John Dewey essays. So this is all John Dewey, but Studies in Logical Theory was not just John Dewey. He had some other contributors, his students. And one of the things that was added was an introduction. The introduction, I believe, was written especially for this book. The other essays were, in some cases, written before, and in some cases, written after the content from Studies in Logical Theory. Actually, only one of them was written before. One of them, Some Stages in Logical Thought, was written before the essays from Studies in Logical Theory. Some Stages in Logical Thought was written in 1900, published, I should say, 1900. Then Studies in Logical Theory, was published in 1903. And then the rest of this book is comprised of essays published after Studies in Logical Theory. So if that sounds a little bit confusing, it actually can be, because you're not reading these in chronological order. I always prefer to read the essays in chronological order from when they were written. You can see the thought develop in the author over time. Like the introduction here is sizable, and it almost presumes that you've read the book already. It almost presumes that you've read Studies in Logical Theory, and then you're coming back for this one as well. It's just not, it should be an afterword. So if I was the editor, I'd put Some Stages in Logical Thought from 1900. Then I'd put Studies in Logical Theory, the John Dewey essays from Studies in Logical Theory. Then I'd put all the other essays. And then at the end of the book, I'd put what is here the introduction. But that's just my own preference. Other people don't apparently think the way I do. So I'm going to read from one of these essays, and the one that I'm going to read from is Some Stages in Logical Thought, which is chronologically the first essay in this book, and should have been at the beginning of the book, not only because it's chronologically first, but because it's kind of foundational. He talks about things in here that lay the foundation for his later ideas. I think this is actually probably one of his very important early essays. Might not be given as much attention as it should be, but I think John Dewey can be difficult to understand, kind of unapproachable. His essays from Studies in Logical Theory are very challenging. They're from 1903, so this is still somewhat in his early phase, and he's kind of like referencing another book by another author. And I haven't read that other book by that other author, Lotze, a book about logic. And in these 4 essays from Studies in Logical Theory, he's countering Lotze. So if you haven't read Lotze, that's going to be less comprehensible to you than you might prefer it to be. Reading the chronologically first, Some Stages in Logical Thought, the essay from 1900, before those might have helped me understand them when I got to them. There's another essay in here, actually, and that other essay is called The Control of Ideas by Facts. And this one seems to be an attempt to summarize those 4 essays from Studies in Logical Theory, to summarize those 4 into one. So this essay, The Control of Ideas by Facts, was published in 1907 in a series of articles in the Journal of Philosophy, Psychology, and Scientific Methods. So 1907, he seems to sort of attempt to sum up what he had said in the Studies in Logical Theory in 4 essays. When I read this book and I got to that essay, he kind of begins the essay saying he's going to provide, something along the lines of he's gonna provide an explanation of what he had said in his other book. He's going to try to respond to some of the criticisms and clarify his ideas a little bit from what he had said in the other essays. Now, it's all one essay here in this book, but then if you go back to look at the original from 1907, it's 3 essays, and he's combined parts of 1 and 3. There's probably parts of 2 in here. I didn't dig deep enough. It seems like it's mostly from part 1 and part 3, but there's other stuff in these journal articles that have been cut. There may have been additional things that have been added, but I think the editing has more been removing sections from these 3 articles from 07 and combining them. So that was pretty interesting. It does seem like it is a little bit more concise and doesn't ramble on and doesn't really talk about, like, there's a few spots he talks about other authors, but in the edited version for this book, he cut those parts out. That was some of the stuff he removed. So it doesn't really talk about any other authors. It puts it together in a way that you can just read it and get it. So that was one of the better essays, I thought. There's another essay in here about more specifically about pragmatism, and that one was pretty good as well. I may come back to these essays. I probably will come back to these essays, possibly in a part 2 of this book. I haven't decided. Possibly in another book as I come across them. I probably will come across them somewhere along the line, or I'll return to this book. But in the meantime, I'm going to focus on the one essay, the earliest essay here, Some Stages in Logical Thought. Like all my episodes, I'm going to read a couple sections of this and provide a little bit of feedback, maybe a little bit of summary if I can, because it's difficult. I feel like I'll be doing a pretty good job if I can just summarize what John Dewey is saying here, let alone provide coherent feedback, because it's challenging material. And I'm going to cover quite a bit of this essay and see if I can make heads or tails of what he's saying and see if I can find ways to apply what he's talking about to the modern world and the modern political predicament. So he says, quote, "The man in the street, when asked what he thinks about a certain matter, often replies that he does not think at all, he knows. The suggestion is that thinking is a case of active uncertainty, set over against conviction or unquestioning assurance. When he adds that he does not have to think, but knows, the further implication is that thinking, when needed, leads to knowledge, and that its purpose or object is to secure stable equilibrium. It is the purpose of this paper to show some of the main stages through which thinking, understood in this way, actually passes in its attempt to reach its most effective working, that is, the maximum of reasonable certainty. I wish to show how a variety of modes of thinking, easily recognizable in the progress of both the race and the individual, may be identified and arranged as successive species of the relationship which doubting bears to assurance, as various ratios, so to speak, which the vigor of doubting bears to mere acquiescence. The presumption is that the function of questioning is one which has continually grown in intensity and range, that doubt is continually chased back, and being cornered, fights more desperately, and thus clears the ground more thoroughly. Its successive stations or arrests constitute stages of thinking. Or to change the metaphor, just in the degree that what has been accepted as fact, the object of assurance, loses stable equilibrium, the tension involved in the questioning attitude increases, until a readjustment gives a new and less easily shaken equilibrium. The natural tendency of man is not to press home a doubt, but to cut inquiry as short as possible. The practical man's impatience with theory has become a proverb. It expresses just the feeling that, since the thinking process is of use only in substituting certainty for doubt, any apparent prolongation of it is useless speculation, wasting time and diverting the mind from important issues. To follow the line of least resistance is to cut short the stay in the sphere of doubts and suggestions, and to make the speediest return into the world where one can act. The result, of course, is that difficulties are evaded or surmounted rather than really disposed of. Hence, in spite of the opposition of the would-be practical man, the needs of practice, of economy, and of efficiency have themselves compelled a continual deepening of doubt and widening of the area of investigation. It is within this evolution that we have to find our stages of thinking. The initial stage is where doubt is hardly endured but not entertained. It is no welcome guest but an intruder, to be got rid of as speedily as possible. Development of alternative and competitive suggestions, the forming of suppositions of ideas, goes but a little way. The mind seizes upon the nearest or most convenient instrument of dismissing doubt and reattaining security. At the other end is the definitive and conscious search for problems, and the development of elaborate and systematized methods of investigation, the industry and technique of science. Between these limits come processes which have started out upon the path of doubt and inquiry and then halted by the way. End quote. Okay, so here we have a sort of rough overview of what his objective is with this essay. And basically he says if you talk to a common person on the street about something, they might say they don't think they know. If you ask them what they think about a question, they'll say, I don't think I know. There's a difference. The common person understands the difference between thinking and knowing. And he understands that there's no point thinking about something once you know it. It's better to know than to think. You might think something, but to think it and not to know it means that you have some bit of doubt left over. Once you know it, you've purged all the doubt. You no longer doubt it. You know it. You don't have to think about it anymore. This is the common conception of thinking, and John Dewey really supports this. And he says the purpose of this paper is to explore this very mode, this very understanding of thinking, and to explore how our thought, our modes of thinking, our ways of thinking about things has changed over the years of our civilization, given an understanding of thinking as the quest for certainty, right? The attempt to put aside doubt and achieve a kind of equilibrium where we no longer are overcome with doubt. We're certain about things. We know things. We feel confident enough in our knowledge to act upon the things. You don't really act upon something more often than not. You don't really act upon something if you doubt it. It's once you feel some security in what you believe that you can begin to act on those beliefs. So moving on from there to the first stage in his stages of logical thought, he talks about fixed ideas. And in this section he says, quote, "In the first stage of the journey, beliefs are treated as something fixed and static. To those who are using them, they are simply another kind of fact. They are used to settled doubts, but the doubts are treated as arising quite outside the ideas themselves. Nothing is further from recognition than that ideas themselves are open to doubt, or need criticism and revision. Indeed, the one who uses static meanings is not even aware that they originated, and have been elaborated, for the sake of dealing with conflicts and problems. The ideas are just there, and they may be used, like any providential dispensation, to help men out of the troubles into which they have fallen. Words are generally held responsible for this fixation of the idea, for this substantiation of it into a kind of thing. A long line of critics has made us familiar with the invincible habit of supposing that wherever there is a name, there is some reality corresponding to it, of supposing that general and abstract words have their equivalent objects somewhere in rerum natura, as have also singular and proper names. We know with what simplicity of self-confidence the English empirical school has accounted for the ontological speculation of Plato. Words tend to fix intellectual contents and give them a certain air of independence and individuality. That some truth here is expressed, there can be no question. Indeed, the attitude of mind of which we are speaking is well illustrated in the person who goes to the dictionary in order to settle some problem in morals, politics, or science, who would end some discussion regarding a material point by learning what meaning is attached to terms by the dictionary as authority. The question is taken as lying outside of the sphere of science or intellectual inquiry, since the meaning of the word, the idea, is unquestionable and fixed. But this petrifying influence of words is, after all, only a superficial explanation. There must be some meaning present, or the word could not fix it. There must be something which accounts for the disposition to use names as a medium of fossilization. There is, in truth, a certain real fact, an existent reality, behind both the word and the meaning it stands for. This reality is social usage. The person who consults a dictionary is getting an established fact when he turns there for the definition of a term. He finds the sense in which the word is currently used. Social customs are no less real than physical events. It is not possible to dispose of this fact of common usage by reference to mere convention or any other arbitrary device. A form of social usage is no more an express invention than any other social institution. It embodies the permanent attitude, the habit, taken towards certain recurring difficulties or problems in experience. Ideas, or meanings fixed in terms, show the scheme of values which the community uses in appraising matters that need consideration and which are indeterminate or unassured. They are held up as standards for all its members to follow. Here is the solution of the paradox. The fixed or static idea is a fact expressing an established social attitude, a custom. It is not merely verbal, because it denotes a force which operates, as all customs do, in controlling particular cases. But since it marks a mode of interpretation, a scheme for assigning values, a way of dealing with doubtful cases, it falls within the sphere of ideas. Or, coming to the life of the individual, the fixed meaning represents not a state of consciousness fixed by a name, but a recognition of a habitual way of belief, a habit of understanding. End quote. Okay, so what does that mean? What did he just say? He said, well, the first stage we're going to explore in our waltz through the stages of logical thought is going to be the domain of fixed ideas. And this is a very early time of thinking when you just have an idea that has been formed culturally. So, like, what are these fixed ideas and where did they come from? He says, well, originally, we've kind of talked about language, speaking language, and that once you can put a word on something, you fix its meaning. He says words are generally held responsible for the fixation of the idea and for the substantiation of the idea into a kind of thing. That when we name something, we kind of lock it into place. And he says people who go directly to the dictionary are expressing this mode of thinking. He says the attitude of mind of which we're speaking is well illustrated in the person who goes to the dictionary in order to settle some problem in morals, politics, or science. And it's almost like someone who doesn't think, who says, well, what we need to do is find the answer. Not that we need to uncover the answer or we need to develop the answer, we need to solve the problem, but that we need to find the answer in a book, which is a book of answers. Find some other, kind of where somebody has locked it down, whether it's religious texts or any other thing. But especially like he's talking about people who give, not just people who depend on fixed beliefs, but people who attribute that to the word, the existence of the word. But he says that that's pointing to the existence of words as what causes these ideas to get fixed in the first place, are clearly missing something, because there's a fact that the word is trying to express that was there before the word arrived, before the word was crafted. But he says that the reality is social usage. So the person who consults a dictionary is getting an established fact. The fact that he's getting is the fact of how the word is currently being used. What is the social custom? That's the fact of the matter. People currently use this word in this way to mean this thing. And he says that ideas or meanings fixed in terms, so using those things to mean kind of as synonyms, ideas or meanings fixed in terms, show the scheme of values which the community uses in appraising matters that need consideration and which are indeterminate or unassured. The tools that the community has, right? The scheme of values, the social tools, the moral tools, the intellectual tools that the community uses to appraise things are the ideas that they have crafted. Well, really more deeply than the ideas they've crafted, they are the social customs, right? The mechanisms that they use to deal with problems are the social customs, and the social customs are shared with everybody, fixed in everybody's mind through the use of language and ideas. He says a fixed or static idea is a fact expressing an established social attitude. It's not merely verbal, because it denotes a force which operates. It's talking about something above and beyond just words. There's some truth or meaning or power behind the word, and that is, the force of social custom, the force of habit among people, and the capacity of people to share in their habits. He says the fixed meaning represents not a state of consciousness fixed by a name, but a recognition of a habitual way of belief, a habit of understanding. So the habits that we have of understanding the challenges in our environment are the habits that underlie ideas and words. So moving on from there, he begins to talk a little bit about ancient and primitive people, and he says, quote, "We find an apt illustration of fixed ideas in the rules prevalent in primitive communities, rules which minutely determine all acts in which the community as a whole is felt to have an interest. These rules are facts because they express customs and carry with them certain sanctions. Their meaning does not cease with judicial utterance. They are made valid at once in a practical way against anyone who departs from them. Yet as rules, they are ideas, for they express general ways of defining doubtful matters in experience and of reestablishing certainty. An individual may fail in acknowledgement of them, and explicit reference is then necessary. For one who has lost himself in the notion that ideas are psychical and subjective, I know of no better way to appreciate the significance of an idea than to consider that a social rule of judgment is nothing but a certain way of viewing or interpreting facts. As such, it is an idea. The point that is of special interest to us here, however, is that these ideas are taken as fixed and unquestionable, and that the cases to which they are to apply are regarded as in themselves equally fixed. So far as concerns the attitude of those who employ these sort of ideas, the doubt is simply as to what idea should be in a particular case. Even the Athenian Greeks, for instance, long kept up the form of indicting and trying a tree or implement through which some individual had been killed. There was a rule, a fixed idea, for dealing with all who offended against the community by destroying one of its citizens. The fact that an inanimate object, a thing without intention or volition, offended, was not a material circumstance. It made no difference in the case. That is, there was no doubt as to the nature of the fact. It was as fixed as was the rule. With advance in the complexity of life, however, rules accumulate, and discrimination, That is, a certain degree of inquiring and critical attitude enters in. Inquiry takes effect, however, in seeking among a collection of fixed ideas just the one to be used, rather than in directing suspicion against any rule or idea as such, or in an attempt to discover or constitute a new one. It is hardly necessary to refer to the development of casuistry, or to the multiplication of distinctions within dogmas, or to the growth of ceremonial law in cumbrous detail, to indicate what the outcome of this logical stage is likely to be. The essential thing is that doubt and inquiry are directed neither at the nature of the intrinsic fact itself, nor at the value of the idea as such, but simply at the manner in which one is attached to the other. Thinking falls outside both fact and idea, and into the sphere of their external connection. It is still a fiction of judicial procedure that there is already in existence some custom or law under which every possible dispute, that is, every doubtful or unassured case, falls, and that the judge only declares which law is applicable in the particular case. This point of view has tremendously affected the theory of logic in its historic development." End quote. So here we get a few interesting features that arise with the development of law. Law as fixed ideas. And he basically says that the law, the rule, is just as fixed as any other idea. And even in the Athenian Greeks, the law was considered fixed, and the circumstances were considered fixed, which is more difficult for him to. It's kind of a more difficult concept to understand what is meant by that. But the idea here is that it doesn't seem that thought is a method of exploring circumstances. It's kind of given that the circumstances are easy to comprehend, or easy enough to comprehend to be able to apply a law to them, so that, like, the Greeks would try an inanimate object for a murder without stopping to think that the tree can't murder somebody. It's just, here's the idea, here's the circumstances, apply the law to the circumstances, and then, like, that's the whole point of being a judge, is what law applies to what circumstance. No real thinking involved in judgment. But he says that over time, like, life grows more complex, and the number of rules in existence starts piling up, and it becomes more difficult to determine which rule to apply. And there forces into circumstance a sort of judgment that's not just referring to a basic, simple idea, but necessary judgment to determine which idea is to be applied, which rule is to be applied. So the beginnings are in place for the movement into the next stage of thought. So here he talks a bit interestingly about the relationship of fixed ideas to conservatism. Now, of course, John Dewey is far from a conservative, so he doesn't necessarily speak in positive, glowing terms about conservatism and its relation to dogma. But we have to kind of take it with a grain of salt if we're going to dig in and understand John Dewey, which we have to do if we're going to dig in and understand pragmatism. So here he says, quote, "One of the chief, perhaps the most important instrumentalities in developing and maintaining fixed ideas is the need of instruction in the way in which it is given. If ideas were called into play only when doubtful cases actually arise, they could not help retaining a certain amount of vitality and flexibility. But the community always instructs its new members as to its ways of disposing of these cases before they present themselves. Ideas are preferred, in other words, separated from present doubt and remote from application, in order to escape future difficulties and the need of any thinking. In primitive communities, this is the main purport of instruction, and it remains such to a very considerable degree. There is a prejudgment rather than a judgment proper. When the community uses its resources to fix certain ideas in the mind, that is, certain ways of interpreting and regarding experience, ideas are necessarily formulated so as to assume a rigid and independent form. They are doubly removed from the sphere of doubt. The attitude is uncritical and dogmatic in the extreme, so much so that one might question whether it is to be properly designated as a stage of thinking. In this form, ideas become the chief instruments of social conservation. Judicial decision and penal correction are restricted and ineffective methods of maintaining social institutions unchanged, compared with instilling in advance uniform ideas, fixed modes of appraising all social questions and issues. These set ideas thus become the embodiment of the values which any group has realized and intends to perpetuate. The fixation supports them against dissipation through attrition of circumstance, and against destruction through hostile attack. It would be interesting to follow out the ways in which such values are put under the protection of the gods and of religious rites, or themselves erected into quasi-divinities, as among the Romans. This, however, would hardly add anything to the logic of the discussion, although it would indicate the importance attached to the fixation of ideas and the thoroughgoing character of the means used to secure immobilization. The conserving value of the dogmatic attitude, the point of view which takes ideas as fixed, is not to be ignored. When society has no methods of science for protecting and perpetuating its achieved values, there is practically no other resort than such crystallization. Moreover, with any possible scientific progress, some equivalent of the fixed idea must remain. The nearer we get to the needs of action, the greater absoluteness must attach to ideas. The necessities of action do not await our convenience. Emergencies continually present themselves, where the fixity required for successful activity cannot be attained through the medium of investigation. The alternative to vacillation, confusion, and futility of action is importation to ideas of a positive and secured character, not in strict logic belonging to them. It is this sort of determination that Hegel seems to have in mind in what he terms the understanding. Apart from the understanding, he says, there is no fixity or accuracy in the region either of theory or practice. And again, understanding sticks to fixity of characters and their distinctions from one another. It treats each meaning as having a subsistence of its own. In technical terminology, also, this is what is meant by positing ideas, hardening meanings. End quote. So he really kind of says that this is a necessary part of, he points out, like, this is the source of dogma. One of the things here is, like, he says the important part of developing and maintaining fixed ideas is in instruction, the means of instruction, because when the problem arises, when the emergency arises, when the challenge arises, you don't want to have to try to figure it out then. You already need to have an answer in your pocket to how to deal with this situation, something that you've already learned by the experiences of your forefathers. You don't want to have to learn how to solve problems on the fly when the problem appears. This is just passing knowledge down from one generation to another, and that's only possible with some degree of fixity of ideas. You have to trust that your ideas are good, and your children, or your students or whatever, when they receive the ideas from you, have to trust you that those ideas are good. They don't necessarily have to reprove every point that you make to them. They have to be able to trust you that the capital of New York is Albany. They just have to believe you. They can't verify everything. And so there has to be a fixity of ideas. Part of the instruction is giving these fixed ideas to the next generation and imparting them as fixed ideas. And this serves an important role in having a functioning society. And from there, he begins to talk about modifying the various ideas. He says, quote, "In recognizing that fixation of intellectual content is a precondition of effective action, we must not overlook the modification that comes with the advance of thinking into more critical forms. At the outset, fixity is taken as the rightful possession of the ideas themselves. It belongs to them and is their essence. As the scientific spirit develops, we see that it is we who lend fixity to the ideas, and that this loan is for a purpose to which the meaning of the ideas is accommodated. Fixity ceases to be a matter of intrinsic structure of ideas and becomes an affair of security in using them. Hence, the important thing is the way in which we fix the idea, the manner of the inquiry which results in definition. We take the idea as if it were fixed in order to secure the necessary stability of action. The crisis past, the idea drops its borrowed investiture and reappears as surmise. When we substitute for ideas as uniform rules by which to decide doubtful cases, that making over of ideas, which is requisite to make them fit, the quality of thought alters. We may fairly say that we have come into another stage. The idea is now regarded as essentially subject to change, as a manufactured article, needing to be made ready for use. To determine the condition of this transition lies beyond my purpose, since I have in mind only a descriptive setting forth of the periods through which, as a matter of fact, thought has passed in the development of the inquiry function, without raising the problem of its why and how. At this point, we shall not do more than note that, as the scheduled stock of fixed ideas grows larger, their application to specific questions becomes more difficult, prolonged, and roundabout. There has to be a definite hunting for the specific idea which is appropriate. There has to be comparison of it with other ideas. This comes to involve a certain amount of mutual compromise and modification before selection is possible. The idea thus gets somewhat shaken. It has to be made over so that it may harmonize with other ideas, possessing equal worth. Often the very accumulation of fixed ideas commands this reconstruction. The dead weight of the material becomes so great that it cannot sustain itself without a readjustment of the center of gravity. Simplification and systematization are required, and these call for reflection. Critical cases come up in which the fiction of an idea or rule already in existence cannot be maintained. It is impossible to conceal that old ideas have to be radically modified before the situation can be dealt with. The friction of circumstance melts away the congealed fixity. Judgment becomes legislative. Seeking illustrations at large, we find this change typified in Hebrew history in the growing importance of the prophet over the judge, in the transition from a justification of conduct through bringing particular cases into conformity with existent laws, into that affected by personal right-mindedness, enabling the individual to see the law in each case for himself. Profoundly as this changed conception of the relation between law and particular case affected moral life, it did not, among Semites, directly influence the logical sphere. With the Greeks, however, we find a continuous and marked departure from positive declaration of custom. We have assemblies meeting to discuss and dispute, and finally, upon the basis of the considerations thus brought to view, to decide. The man of counsel is set side by side with the man of deed. Odysseus was much experienced not only because he knew the customs and ways of old, but even more because from the richness of his experience he could make the pregnant suggestion to meet the new crisis. It is hardly too much to say that it was the emphasis put by the Greek mind upon discussion, at first as preliminary to decision and afterwards to legislation, which generated logical theory. Discussion is thus an apt name for this attitude of thought. It is bringing various beliefs together, shaking one against another, and tearing down their rigidity. It is conversation of thoughts. It is dialogue, the mother of dialectic, in more than the etymological sense. No process is more recurrent in history than the transfer of operations carried on between different persons into the arena of the individual's own consciousness. The discussion, which at first took place by bringing ideas from different persons into contact, by introducing them into the forum of competition, and by subjecting them to critical comparison and selective decision, finally became a habit of the individual with himself. He became a miniature social assemblage, in which the pros and cons were brought into play, struggling for the mastery, for final conclusion. In some such way we conceive reflection to be born. End quote. Okay, so here we have like the birth of the next stage of thinking in the modification of ideas. The fact that ideas are no longer quite so rigid. And what's happening is that as the rules accumulate, you're not just deciding which rule applies in which case, but you have potentially competing ideas, competing rules. And what happens is different people from different places, with different perspectives and different circumstances, will engage in dialogue with one another, will engage in discussion with one another in assemblies, in crafting legislation or crafting judgments in cases, building constitutions and things like that. These assemblies of people sharing their ideas, and the process is that they have to come to a conclusion. And sometimes it's not so simple as just choosing the right law for the case at that moment. The laws have to get modified. Sometimes the laws have to get slightly changed. You have conflicting ideas and you're trying to come to a conclusion or a decision. The ideas have to get shifted and modified. He calls it being shaken against one another or being shaken out. The incongruities have to get resolved. And he says that there's a process by which this dialogue begins to happen inside people, where instead of everybody at the assembly sharing their ideas, people are taking these dialogues internally, and they're thinking, maybe this, maybe that. On the one hand, this. On the other hand, that. They're taking the ideas and they're weighing against them in their own minds, and they're weighing against them, or they're shifting and changing them, updating them as necessary. And he says, here you have the real birth of reflection. From here, he begins to talk about the uncertainty of ideas. And he says, quote, "It is evident that discussion, the agitation of ideas, if judged from the standpoint of the older fixed ideas, is a destructive process. Ideas are not only shaken together and apart, they are so shaken in themselves that their whole validity becomes doubtful. Mind, and not merely beliefs, becomes uncertain. The attempt to harmonize different ideas means that in themselves they are discrepant. The search for a conclusion means that accepted ideas are only points of view, and hence personal affairs. Needless to say, it was the sophists who emphasized and generalized this negative aspect, this presupposition of loss of assurance, of inconsistency, of subjectivity. They took it as applying not only to this, that, and the other idea, but to ideas as ideas. Since ideas are no longer fixed contents, they are just expressions of an individual's way of thinking. Lacking inherent value, they merely express the interests that induce the individual to look this way rather than that. They are made by the individual's point of view, and hence will be unmade if he can be led to change his point of view. Where all was fixity, now all is instability. Where all was certitude, now nothing exists save opinion, based on prejudice, interest, or arbitrary choice. The modern point of view, while condemning sophistry, yet often agrees with it in limiting the reflective attitude as such to self-involution and self-conceit. From Bacon down, the appeal is to observation, to attention to facts, to concern with the external world. The sole genuine guarantee of truth is taken to be appeal to facts, and thinking as such is something different. If reflection is not considered to be merely variable matter, it is considered to be at least an endless mulling over of things. It is the futile attempt to spin truth out of inner consciousness. It is introspection and theorizing and mere speculation. Such wholesale depreciation ignores the value inherent in even the most subjective reflection, for it takes the settled estate, which is proof that thought is not needed, or that it has done its work, as if it supplied the standard for the occasions in which problems are hard upon us and doubt is rife. It takes the conditions which come about after and because we have thought to measure the conditions which call out thinking. Whenever we really need to reflect, we cannot appeal directly to the fact, for the adequate reason that the stimulus to thinking arises just because facts have slipped away from us." End quote. So what do we have here? He talks about the instability that arises as these ideas are agitated and have to be compared against one another. Suddenly, ideas themselves are not fixed. None of the ideas are fixed. They're all subject to modification, And so none of them have any real, permanent, coherent fixedness to them. And that can very easily flow over into saying that no ideas have any real truth to them. And it can open up the doors to relativism. And of course, Dewey, in some sense here, calls the sophists relativists, as is often the case. And maybe they are relativists to an extent. And maybe relativism is, in some sense, has some truth to it. But he says, essentially, no matter how you slice it, there is some truth to the fact that things just aren't cut out that way. He says, the modern world, in a way, agrees with the depreciation of evaluation and of ideas in general, because the modern world says, well, thinking about things, evaluating things, reflecting on things, comparing ideas with one another is all nonsense anyway. You should be observing facts. You should be observing the world. You should be studying things and not reflecting. So there is a depreciation of the idea because of its instability. So while we may criticize the sophists, in a sense, we agree with them. And he says that this ignores the point that we can't just turn to the facts all the time to find our answer, because the facts of our environment are what caused us to have the question. And we have to uncover what facts we will have to acquire in order to resolve the situation created by the current array of facts. What new facts are missing that solves the problem before me right now? So there's always an amount of reflection that's necessary in thinking. Now we begin to enter the third stage of logical thought, where we are searching for a common denominator. That probably should be anticipated. He says, quote, reflection involves running over various ideas, sorting them out, comparing one with another, trying to get one which will unite in itself the strength of two, searching for new points of view, developing new suggestions, guessing, suggesting, selecting, and rejecting. The greater the problem, and the greater the shock of doubt and resultant confusion and uncertainty, the more prolonged and more necessary is the process of mere thinking. It is a more obvious phase of biology than of physics, of sociology than of chemistry, but it persists in established sciences. If we take even a mathematical proposition, not after it has been demonstrated and is thus capable of statement in adequate logical form, but while in process of discovery and proof, the operation of this subjective phase is manifest. So much so, indeed, that a distinguished modern mathematician has said that the paths which the mathematical inquirer traverses in any new field are more akin to those of the experimentalist, and even to those of the poet and artist, than to those of the Euclidean geometer. What makes the essential difference between modern research and the reflection of, say, the Greeks is not the absence of mere thinking, but the presence of conditions for testing its results. The elaborate system of checks and balances found in the technique of modern experimentation. The thinking process does not now go on endlessly in terms of itself, but seeks outlet through reference to particular experiences. It is tested by this reference, not, however, as if a theory could be tested by directly comparing it with facts, an obvious impossibility, but through use in facilitating commerce with facts. It is tested as glasses are tested. Things are looked at through the medium of specific meanings to see if thereby they assume a more orderly and clearer aspect, if they are less blurred and obscure. The reaction of the Socratic school against the sophistic may serve to illustrate the third stage of thinking. This movement was not interested in the de facto shaking of received ideas and a discrediting of all thinking. It was concerned rather with the virtual appeal to a common denominator involved in bringing different ideas into relation with one another. In their comparison and mutual modification, it saw evidence of the operation of a standard permanent meaning, passing judgment upon their conflict, and revealing a common principle and standard of reference. It dealt not with the shaking and dissolution, but with a comprehensive, permanent idea finally to emerge. Controversy and discussion among different individuals may result in extending doubt, manifesting the incoherency of accepted ideas and so throwing an individual into an attitude of distrust, but it also involves an appeal to a single thought to be accepted by both parties, thus putting an end to the dispute. This appeal to a higher court, this possibility of attaining a total and abiding intellectual object, which should bring into relief the agreeing elements in contending thoughts and banish the incompatible factors, animated the Socratic search for the concept, the elaboration of the Platonic hierarchy of ideas, in which the higher substantiate the lower, and the Aristotelian exposition of the systematized methods by which general truths may be employed to prove propositions otherwise doubtful. At least, this historical development will serve to illustrate what is involved in the transition from the second to the third stage, the transformation of discussion into reasoning, of subjective reflection into method of proof. End quote. So you can see at the end where this winds up. He says people aren't really just out to shake out the ideas. They have to come to a conclusion. They have to know how they're going to come to a conclusion. They have to know how they're going to know what's right and what's wrong. And what they're looking for is a system of ideas that where the connections between the various ideas are amplified or strengthened, and the disparities between different ideas are destroyed and eliminated. Something is proven right, something else is proven wrong, and an answer is had, and a new idea emerges, and this is like the better idea. And we see a sort of hierarchy of ideas. We see ideas that are used to judge other ideas. And we see the fact that this comes back to reference to observation and experience. He says we understand these things the way we test them, the way we test our glasses. We look at our experiences, we look at the facts of the world, and we say, does this make sense better with our new idea? Is it clearer with the new idea? So now we're testing things against experience. We're looking for proof. We're looking to justify our ideas by referring back to experience. But we also get sort of laws or ideas that are deeper than other ideas, and we get the ideas of logic, the basic syllogisms, the basic concepts of logic are deeper, more profound ideas that can be used to judge other ideas. So we get reasoning, logic, and we get empiricism. So moving on, he begins to talk about first principles. We've heard that term before. He says, quote, "Questions still face us. How about that truth upon which we fall back as guaranteeing the credibility of other statements? How about our major premise? Whence does it derive its guarantee? We may, of course, in turn, subsume it under some further major premise, but an infinite regress is impossible, and on this track we are finally left hanging in the air. For practical purposes, the unquestioned principle may be taken as signifying mutual concession or agreement. It denotes that, as a matter of fact, its truth is not called in question by any of the parties concerned. This does admirably for settling arguments and controversies. It is a good way of amicably arranging matters among those already friends and fellow citizens. But scientifically, the widespread acceptance of an idea seems to testify to custom rather than to truth. Prejudice is strengthened in influence, but hardly in value, by the number who share it. Conceit is nonetheless self-conceit, because it turns the head of many. Great interest was indeed afterward taken in the range of persons who hold truths in common. What is always everywhere held by everybody became of great importance. This, however, was not, in theory, at least, because common agreement was supposed to constitute the major premise, but because it afforded confirmatory evidence of its self-evident and universal character. Hence, the Aristotelian logic necessarily assumes certain first or fundamental truths, unquestioned and unquestionable, self-evident and self-evidencing, neither established nor modified by thought, but standing firm in their own right. This assumption was not, as modern dealers in formal logic would sometimes have it, an external psychological or metaphysical attachment to the theory of reasoning, to be omitted at will from logic as such. It was an essential factor of knowledge that there should be necessary propositions directly apprehended by reason and particular ones directly apprehended by sense. Reasoning could then join them. Without the truths, we have only the play of subjective, arbitrary, futile opinion. Judgment has not taken place, and assertion is without warrant. Hence the scheduling of first truths is an organic part of any reasoning which is occupied with securing demonstration, surety of assent, or valid conviction. To deny the necessary place of ultimate truths in the logical system of Aristotle and his followers is to make them players in a game of social convention. It is to overlook, to invert the fact that they were sincerely concerned with the question of attaining the grounds and process of assurance. Hence they were obliged to assume primary intuitions, metaphysical, physical, moral, and mathematical axioms, in order to get the pegs of certainty to which to tie the bundles of otherwise contingent propositions. End quote. So there you see a little bit about first principles and just the basic idea that you need to have something, if you are using an idea to judge or evaluate between other ideas, you need to have some justification for that idea. Isn't that idea just waiting to be brought up against some other conflicting idea? There's no justification. What is the justification for the idea that judges the other ideas? What point is there some bottom, some post, if you will, of reason or of something that you can attach a post of truth that you can attach your reasoning to? How about that? And this is the concept of first principles. And John Dewey says first principles are necessary. They get disparaged. The concept gets disparaged. I sometimes disparage the concept, but at some point, some first principle, some true thing that doesn't have to be justified by some other prior, more fundamental thing, has to sit somewhere, or it's just an infinite series of things justified by things justified by things. And common sense philosophy is, in a way, an attempt to address this question by revisiting what we should be considering first principles. So now I'm going to introduce the fourth stage of thinking, which is empirical science. So jumping forward here a little bit, he says, quote, "The growth of freedom of thought during the Renaissance was revelation of the intrinsic momentum of the thought process itself. It was not a mere reaction from and against medieval scholasticism. It was the continued operation of the machinery which the scholastics had set a-going. Doubt and inquiry were extended into the region of particulars, of matters of fact, with the view of reconstituting them through discovery of their own structure, no longer with the intention of leaving that unchanged while transforming their claim to credence by connecting them with some authoritative principles. Thought no longer found satisfaction in appraising them in a scale of values according to their nearness to or remoteness from fixed truths. Such work had been done to a nicety, and it was futile to repeat it. Thinking must find a new outlet. It was out of employment and set to discover new lands. Galileo and Copernicus were travelers, so much so as the Crusader, Marco Polo, and Columbus. Hence, the fourth stage, covering what is popularly known as inductive and empirical science. Thought takes the form of inference instead of proof. Proof, as we have already seen, is accepting or rejecting a given proposition on the ground of its connection or lack of connection with some other proposition, conceded or established. But inference does not terminate in any given proposition. It is after precisely those not given. It wants more facts, different facts. Thinking in the mode of inference insists upon terminating in an intellectual advance, in a consciousness of truths hitherto escaping us. Our thinking must not now pass certain propositions after challenging them, must not admit them because they exhibit certain credentials, showing a right to be received into the upper circle of intellectual society. Thinking endeavors to compel things as they present themselves to yield up something hitherto obscure or concealed. This advance and extension of knowledge through thinking seems to be well designated by the term inference. It does not certify what is otherwise doubtful, but goes from the known to the unknown. It aims at pushing out the frontiers of knowledge, not at marking those already attained with signposts. Its technique is not a scheme for assigning status to beliefs already possessed, but is a method for making friends with facts and ideas hitherto alien. Inference reaches out, fills in gaps. Its work is measured not by the patents of standing it issues, but by the material increments of knowledge it yields. Inventio is more important than judicium, discovery than proof. End quote. So here you see a kind of overview of empirical science, the fourth stage, which I began to discuss briefly. So we've got fixed ideas, then we've got discussion, then we've got reason, and then we've got inference, empirical science, learning by observation, discovering more things, reaching tentative conclusions, not building ironclad laws, but saying, it looks as though this is the case. I'm going to surmise that this is the case based on what I've seen thus far. And let's continue to explore. Let's operate as if it was the case. Let's examine to see if it's the case. It's all about uncovering truths. And it's kind of a tentative process where you can draw a conclusion about what you're seeing, right? You've measured something, and we've measured it with a degree of accuracy that we can call true. But you're continually getting more information, because as you get information, you continually uncover things that are problematic, things that you don't know, information that you don't know how to get, sometimes things that conflict with other things that you think you know. It's much more empirical, and it's much more involved with circumstances. And this is this whole concept that Dewey is talking about here is important because it relates to pragmatism. It relates to the idea that we think in order to solve problems. We don't think in order to acquire the truth. We encounter a problem in our experience, and then we have to solve it. So that's what's going on. That's the basis of thinking, the basis of cognition, and that's a pragmatic concept. So I have gone on long enough with this essay. Like I said, there are a few other essays in here that I would like to address, but I just haven't decided yet if I'll come back to them. Probably not next episode, but maybe I'll come back to these essays when I find them elsewhere. Maybe I'll come back to this book. It's all to be determined. But anyway, thank you for listening, and I'll talk to you again next time.